The crystal shattered against the white marble with a sound like a muffled gunshot, an exclamation point to a public execution. Zuri Ashford was on her knees, not because she was weak, but because the woman standing above her, dripping in diamonds and a casual, inherited cruelty, had just shoved her into the floor of the Sapphire Lounge in front of 50 of Seoul's most powerful elite. Not a single soul moved to help. Red wine bloomed across Zuri's crisp white shirt, spreading like a fresh chest wound. Her natural curls, once pinned into a neat, professional bun, had come loose to hang around her face like a dark velvet curtain. Through that curtain, she saw it all. The designer heels stepping back to avoid the splash, the shimmer of silk gowns, and the wall of smartphones rising into the air like a firing squad, recording her humiliation for the digital entertainment of the board. "Go back to whatever dusty corner of the world you crawled out of," the woman sneered, her voice ringing out to every corner of the penthouse. "You smell like marsh water and poverty. You don't belong here. You will never belong here. And if I see your face in my world again, I'll make sure you regret the day you stepped foot in this country." The room erupted. A chorus of laughter from people whose combined net worth could buy a small nation followed, all directed at the woman on the floor. Across the room, leaning against the mahogany bar with a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, Seo Minyi watched. He didn't laugh. He didn't intervene. His eyes, cold enough to freeze the Han River in mid-July, held the quiet, patient attention of a predator who hadn't yet decided whether to hunt. He wore his power like a tailored suit, still, silent, and lethal. What nobody in that room knew, not the woman standing over her, not the crowd of laughing socialites, not even the dangerous man at the bar, was that Zuri wasn't there for the tips. While they mocked her poverty, the microtransmitter hidden in her bow tie was finishing a deep packet injection into the building's private server. Zuri Ashford was a tech prodigy, a ghost in the machine, and a secret billionaire with a net worth that made their family inheritances look like pocket change. She had spent 15 years hunting the man who murdered her parents, and tonight, the trail had led her here. Zuri lifted her head slowly. She didn't wipe the wine from her face. She didn't fix her torn vest. She simply looked at the woman who had shoved her and memorized the fear that flickered in the heiress's eyes when she realized the waitress wasn't crying. The poor girl was done serving. Within 72 hours, Zuri would own their bank accounts, their reputations, and their futures. The hunt had officially begun. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, and comment. To understand the woman on the marble floor of the Sapphire Lounge, one had to understand the fire that forged her in the humid, cramped quarters of a public housing project in Atlanta. Before the billions, before the silent war in Seoul, there was only a 10-year-old girl sitting in a darkened bedroom, the glow of a cracked laptop screen the only light in her world. The tragedy hadn't been a quiet thing. It had been a symphony of screeching tires and the rhythmic, terrifying thud of a heavy door being kicked off its hinges. Zuri remembered the scent of her father's expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of gunpowder. She remembered her mother's hand over her mouth, a silent plea for her to stay hidden in the crawlspace behind the water heater. From that narrow gap, she had watched the polished shoes of a man who moved with a terrifying, clinical grace. He hadn't just taken their lives. He had taken her father's prototype drive, the culmination of a decade of revolutionary linguistic encryption. When the police sirens finally faded and the foster system spat her out, Zuri didn't cry. Instead, she retreated into the only language that made sense: binary. By 12, she was living in a studio apartment that smelled of burnt coffee and ozone, sharing a single bed with her only companion, a salvaged server she'd rebuilt from a junkyard. While other girls her age were navigating the complexities of middle school social hierarchies, Zuri was navigating the backdoors of international banking systems. She wasn't stealing, she was learning. She watched how money moved like water, how power was nothing more than a series of high-frequency trades and well-placed digital signatures. She called her creation Ashford Global. It began as a small, untraceable freelance firm that solved impossible encryption errors for Silicon Valley giants who didn't care that their savior was a teenager in a faded hoodie. By 16, the invisible prodigy had accumulated her first 10 million. By 20, She had built a ghost empire that held interests in rare earth minerals, deep-sea cabling, and the very cybersecurity systems that the world's most powerful governments relied upon. She lived like a phantom. Her name appeared on no Forbes lists, her face graced no magazine covers. She kept her life packed into a single encrypted hard drive and a carry-on bag, moving through the world with the same quiet dignity she would later display on that lounge floor. She didn't want the fame. She wanted the man with the polished shoes. Every cent she earned was a brick in the wall she was building around her enemies. Every line of code she wrote was a breadcrumb leading her closer to the transaction that had occurred the night her parents died. For 15 years, she had been a shadow, growing larger and darker, until she eclipsed the very people who thought they had destroyed her. Sitting in that cramped Atlanta apartment years ago, Zuri had made a vow to the flickering screen. She would never be small again. She would become so powerful that when she finally stepped into the light, the world would have no choice but to tremble. As she looked up from the floor of the lounge in Seoul, the wine still dripping from her chin, she knew the time for shadows was over. The girl from the projects was gone. The queen had arrived to collect her debt. The transition from the scorched heat of Atlanta to the neon-drenched humidity of Seoul was a shift in more than just geography. It was a descent into a new kind of silence. Zuri arrived at Incheon International Airport not as the titan who controlled the digital pulse of 3 continents, but as a ghost. She carried no designer luggage, only a single battered backpack and a passport that identified her as a 24-year-old student seeking work. To the customs officers, she was just another face in the blur of global migration, young, black, and presumably looking for a fresh start. She didn't head for the glass towers of Gangnam. Instead, she settled into a cramped gasiwon in Mapogu, a room so small her knees touched the wall when she sat on the bed. It was a tactical choice. To catch a predator who lived in the light, she had to become a master of the shadows. Her intelligence team, operating from encrypted servers in Zurich, had traced the final digital signature of her parents' stolen patents to a single, high-security server located within the Sapphire Lounge. Securing the job was the easiest part of the gambit. The management at the lounge was looking for exotic staff to cater to their international clientele, someone who looked the part but lacked the social standing to ask questions. When Zuri stood before the floor manager, her head slightly bowed, her voice a soft, practiced lilt of polite Korean, he saw exactly what she wanted him to see. A girl who needed the money too much to be a threat. The transformation was a ritual. Every evening, Zuri donned the uniform, the crisp white shirt that felt like a straitjacket, the black-fitted vest, and the bow tie that she fastened with the precision of a surgeon. She tucked her natural curls into a tight, severe bun and wiped the ambition from her eyes. In the mirror of the staff locker room, the billionaire vanished. In her place stood the waitress, a woman designed to be looked through, not at. Navigating the invisible world of service was a masterclass in human psychology. In the Sapphire Lounge, the wealthy spoke as if the walls had no ears and the servers had no souls. They discussed illegal mergers, payoff amounts, and the shifting allegiances of the underworld, while Zuri refilled their crystal flutes with vintage Krug. She learned the tilt of a man's head when he was lying, and the way a woman's hand tightened on her clutch when she was afraid. She moved through the velvet-shrouded booths like a phantom, her ears tuned to the frequencies of power. She wasn't just delivering drinks, she was mapping the architecture of a criminal empire. She learned that Seo Minyi sat in the corner booth not because he liked the view, but because it was the only spot in the room with a blind spot for the security cameras. She learned that the socialites who mocked her were often the weakest links in the chain, their vanity a backdoor she could exploit. The work was grueling. Her feet ached, and the weight of the silver trays strained her shoulders, but Zuri welcomed the physical pain. It grounded her. It reminded her that she was earning her revenge with every step. She practiced the art of the blank face, absorbing the casual racism and the sharp dismissals of the elite without a flicker of emotion. Let them think she was small. Let them think she was nothing. The more invisible she became, the more she saw. And as she watched Seo Minyi watch the room, she realized the game was far more dangerous than she had imagined. She was no longer just a coder behind a screen. She was a soldier on the front lines, and the first shot was about to be fired. The air in the Sapphire Lounge was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the low, predatory hum of men who owned the city. Zuri moved through the haze like a shadow, her silver tray a shield, her eyes downward. She had been monitoring Table 7 for an hour. A low-level lieutenant with a twitchy hand had swapped a crystal decanter when the floor manager's back was turned. The target was Seo Minyi, sitting in his usual corner booth, a man who looked like he was carved from obsidian and silence. As Zuri approached, she saw Minyi reach for the glass. The amber liquid inside caught the light, swirling with a faint, oily sheen that only someone trained in chemical signatures would notice. It was a fast-acting neurotoxin, a signature move for those too cowardly to use a blade. She didn't shout. She didn't cause a scene. Instead, as she glided past his table, her foot slipped on a non-existent slick of marble. With a practiced, graceful lurch, she collided softly with the edge of his mahogany table. Her arm brushed his sleeve, and her tray tilted just enough to send a fresh glass of sparkling water cascading directly into his whiskey. The room went still. The twitchy lieutenant stood up, his face pale with aborted triumph. Minyi didn't move. He looked down at his ruined drink, then up at the waitress who was now kneeling, dabbing at the table with a white linen cloth. "I am so sorry, sir," Zuri whispered, her voice a soft, melodic apology. "I'll replace this immediately. It was a clumsy mistake." "You're shaking," Minyi said. His voice was a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. He wasn't looking at the spill. He was looking at her hands. Zuri froze. She wasn't shaking from fear. She was shaking from the adrenaline of the save. She forced her fingers to tremble harder, leaning into the roll. "The floor is slippery, sir. Please let me get you a fresh bottle from the private cellar. This one. It looks tainted by the water." Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the waitress mask slipped. In that fraction of a second, Minyi didn't see a clumsy servant. He saw a woman whose gaze was as sharp as a diamond and twice as hard. He looked at the lieutenant, then back at Zuri. A ghost of a smile, cold and knowing, touched his lips. "The private cellar," Minyi repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. "Go, bring it to my office. We'll finish this conversation away from the noise." 10 minutes later, Zuri stood in the sanctuary of his glass-walled office. The door clicked shut, sealing out the lounge's roar. Minyi sat behind a desk that cost more than a year of her waitress' salary. He poured 2 glasses from a new bottle, one for him and one for her. "I don't usually drink with the staff," he said, sliding the glass across the polished wood. "I don't usually drink on the job," Zuri replied, dropping the submissive lilt. Her posture shifted, her spine straightened, and the quiet dignity he'd admired turned into an unshakable authority. "You saved my life." It wasn't a question. Minyi leaned back, swirling the whiskey. "Why, a girl like you from the projects of Atlanta, if my sources are correct, shouldn't care if a man like me stops breathing." Zuri took a slow sip, the peat and smoke of the alcohol warming her throat. "Maybe I just don't like seeing a good suit ruined by a messy death. Or maybe," she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his, "I'm the only person in this city who actually knows what you're worth, Seo Minyi." Minyi didn't blink. He felt the shift in the room, the sudden weight of a woman who was no longer a ghost. "Who are you, Zuri?" "Right now," she smiled, and it was a dangerous, beautiful thing. "I'm just the girl who's going to make sure you live long enough to see the world burn." The adrenaline from the office encounter still hummed in Zuri's veins as she descended back into the bowels of the Sapphire Lounge. Minyi's question, "Who are you?" hung in the air like a physical weight, but she couldn't afford the luxury of an answer. Not yet. She had saved his life to keep her investigation alive, but the hunt required more than just the favor of a mafia boss. It required hard, cold evidence. The lounge's sub-basement was a labyrinth of reinforced concrete and silent, high-definition cameras. To the rest of the world, this was a high-end liquor cellar, but Zuri's thermal scans had revealed a secondary layer, a private vault used by the syndicate's inner circle to store collateral that never touched a bank ledger. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, her waitress uniform serving as a master key. In this world, a woman with a cleaning rag and a tray was a ghost. She was part of the furniture, beneath the notice of the armed guards who patrolled the upper tiers. Using a signal jammer concealed in her serving apron, Zuri looped the security feed for a 60-second window, a digital sleight of hand she'd perfected at 16. The vault door didn't yield to a key, but to a pulse. She pressed a small, transparent patch against the biometric scanner, a haptic cloner that had captured the floor manager's thumbprint when she'd handed him his coffee that morning. With a soft, hydraulic hiss, the heavy steel retracted. Inside, the air was filtered and cold. The shelves were lined with the spoils of 1,000 broken lives, gold bars, deeds to seized properties, and velvet-lined boxes of unmounted stones. Zuri didn't look at the wealth. Her eyes were fixed on a small, unassuming locker in the far corner, marked with a serial number that matched a ghost file she'd pulled from a corrupted server weeks ago. Her breath hitched as she bypassed the final electronic lock. Inside sat a single, tarnished object. It was a tie bar, platinum, etched with a microscopic pattern of geometric lines that looked like decorative art, but was actually a physical map for a first-generation encryption key. It was the piece of jewelry her father had been wearing the night the shoes clicked across their floor. It was the only thing the killer hadn't burned. Zuri reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold metal. The quiet dignity she wore like armor shattered for a heartbeat, replaced by the raw, jagged grief of the 10-year-old girl in the crawlspace. This wasn't just a trophy, it was a signature. Whoever owned this vault hadn't just stolen her parents' technology, they had relished the destruction of her family. A faint vibration in her earbud snapped her back to the present. The looped feed was about to reset. She didn't steal the tie bar. To take it would be to announce her presence, and Zuri Ashford never attacked until the killing blow was ready. Instead, she used a high-resolution forensic scanner hidden in her palm to capture every scratch, every microscopic etching on the platinum surface. As she slipped out of the vault and the heavy door hissed shut, the waitress returned, her face a mask of practiced submission. But beneath the white cotton shirt, her heart was a drum of war. She had found the link. The shadows of her past weren't just haunting her, they were sitting in the very room where she served drinks. And now she knew exactly whose throat to reach for. The invitation arrived not as a card, but as a command delivered in the low, gravelly snap of Minnie's voice. He wanted the waitress at the Blue Moon Gala, the most exclusive heights of Seoul's social stratosphere, not to serve drinks, but to stand at his side. It was a tactical move on his part, a public display of a predator flaunting a new, exotic pet, but for Zuri, it was the ultimate backdoor. To the world, she was his whim. To Zuri, she was a Trojan horse. She stood in the center of the grand ballroom, draped in a gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her curves like a second skin, though she felt more naked than she ever had in her polyester vest. Her natural curls were pinned back with a single, devastatingly expensive diamond clip, a gift from Minnie that felt like a gilded shackle. Beside her, Minnie moved through the crowd with the lethality of a shark in a koi pond, his hand possessively firm on the small of her back. The mockery began before they had even reached the center of the room. The whispers were sharp, polished needles. "Is that a charity project?" a woman in vintage Chanel murmured, loud enough for the air to carry it. "I heard he plucked her from the scullery. You can dress up the help, but you can't wash off the scent of the kitchen." Zuri kept her gaze fixed forward, her face a masterpiece of serene, unbothered marble. Beside her, she felt Minnie's fingers tighten. He wasn't protecting her, he was testing her. He wanted to see if the quiet dignity he'd admired in the lounge would shatter under the weight of high society vitriol. "Don't mind them," Minnie leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, a gesture that looked intimate to the room but felt like a warning to her. "They hate anything they can't buy, and they definitely can't buy you." "They don't realize I'm the one doing the shopping," Zuri replied, her voice a low, dangerous velvet. As Minnie engaged the Minister of Trade in a tense conversation about port access, Zuri made her move. She excused herself with a graceful nod, heading toward the buffet table near the server's entrance. To the guards, she was just a socialite's arm candy wandering off. To the elite, she was an eyesore to be ignored. She reached into her small, beaded clutch and withdrew a device no larger than a grain of rice, a hardware-level sniffer she'd designed herself. Under the cover of adjusting her heel, she pressed the microscopic bug against the underside of a mahogany console housing the Gala's central networking hub. The connection was instantaneous. In her peripheral vision, a tiny LED on her contact lens flickered green. She was in. While the heiresses around her debated the merits of French skincare, Zuri was watching a live stream of encrypted data packets flood into her private server. She saw the minister's offshore transfers, the hidden ledgers of the Cha family, and the internal memos of the very man standing 20 feet away. She returned to Minnie's side just as the woman in Chanel approached, a mocking smirk playing on her lips. "So tell us, dear," the woman drawled, "what does a girl like you actually do besides look pretty on a powerful man's arm?" Zuri smiled, a slow, predatory expression that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm an architect," she said softly. "I specialize in foundations. I like to see exactly what holds a house up, right before I take the first brick out." She felt Minnie's eyes on her, sharp and knowing. He didn't know about the bug, but he knew the dance had changed. The devil had brought a partner to the ball, and he was beginning to realize she was the one leading the steps. The neon lights of the district flickered in the oily puddles of the alleyway, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the brick. Zuri had slipped away from the Gala's suffocating opulence through a service exit, her midnight blue silk gown shimmering like a bruise in the darkness. She needed the damp, cold air to clear the static of 1,000 intercepted data packets from her mind. But as the heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, the silence of the alley felt wrong. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The first shadow detached itself from a dumpster 20 feet away, then another from the fire escape above. 3 men, dressed in the nondescript tactical gear of professional cleaners, moved with a synchronized efficiency that didn't belong to common street thugs. They were the physical manifestation of the panic she'd sown into the Gala's servers, the Cha family's last-ditch effort to erase the glitch in their system. "The boss wants the bug back, sweetheart," the largest one said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He pulled a serrated combat knife from a sheath at his thigh, the blade dull and non-reflective. "And he wants the hands that planted it." Zuri didn't scream. She didn't plead. She simply reached up and unpinned the diamond clip from her hair, letting her natural curls tumble free. She kicked off her silver stilettos, her bare feet finding purchase on the gritty asphalt. The docile waitress vanished, replaced by a woman whose very posture radiated a lethal, predatory calm. "You're going to need more than 3 men," Zuri said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying register. The big man lunged. Zuri didn't retreat. She exploded forward, entering his guard before he could bring the knife to bear. It wasn't the flashy, cinematic movement of a movie star, but the brutal economy of motion efficiency of Krav Maga. She seized his knife hand with a thumbbrake grip, redirected the momentum, and drove her palm into his chin with the full weight of her hip rotation. His head snapped back with a sickening crack, and he went down before he could draw another breath. The other 2 closed in simultaneously. The one on her left swung a collapsible baton. Zuri stepped offline, trapped his arm against her chest, and delivered a devastating knee to his solar plexus. As he folded, she pivoted on a dime, catching the third man's roundhouse kick midair. She didn't just block it. She used his own force to sweep his standing leg, sending him crashing into a stack of wooden pallets. She moved like liquid, a blur of silk and muscle. The man with the baton tried to rise, but Zuri was already there. She executed a standing armbar, the pressure precise and agonizing, until the baton clattered to the ground. With a final, blurring combination of strikes to his pressure points, she left him slumped against the brick, unconscious. 7 seconds. That was all it took for the invisible waitress to dismantle 3 trained assassins. Zuri stood in the center of the wreckage, her breathing shallow but controlled, a single smear of grease on the hem of her gown. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a goddess of war. She reached into the pocket of the unconscious leader, pulled out his encrypted burner phone, and began a local bypass of its security. A slow, rhythmic clapping echoed from the mouth of the alley. Seo Minyi leaned against a sleek black sedan, his silhouette framed by the neon glow of the street behind him. He watched her with an expression that shifted from shock to a dark, simmering fascination. He had followed her, expecting to play the savior, only to find himself a spectator to a slaughter. "I suppose," Minyi said, his voice a low, dangerous purr, "that I should stop worrying about who's protecting you and start worrying about who's going to protect the city from you." Zuri didn't lower her guard. She stood her ground, the burner phone in one hand and her heels in the other, her eyes burning with a fire that finally matched his own. "You're late, Minyi. I've already taken out the trash." The rain began as a fine mist, turning the grimy asphalt of the alley into a dark mirror that reflected the neon ghosts of Seoul. Zuri stood over the fallen men, her chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, lethal cadence. She didn't bother to hide the burner phone she was stripping of its data, nor did she attempt to reassume the slumped shoulders of the girl who served his drinks. The masquerade hadn't just slipped, it had been incinerated. Minyi stepped into the pool of light cast by a flickering street lamp, his shadow stretching toward her like a dark hand. "A waitress who moves like a Mossad assassin," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "A student who plants military-grade sniffers at a government gala. Tell me, Zuri, was the wine spill part of the choreography too?" Zuri tossed the encrypted phone into the air and caught it with a snap. "The wine was an accident. The fact that I stayed on my knees while they laughed, that was a choice." She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the wet pavement. "You knew I wasn't just the help the moment I saved your life in that office, Minyi. You didn't follow me tonight to protect me. You followed me to see if I was the ghost that's been haunting your servers." Minyi's expression hardened, the facade of the charming crime lord falling away to reveal the cold, jagged edge of the man who ruled the city's underside. He closed the distance between them until they were inches apart, the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain swirling between them. He reached out, his thumb catching a smear of grease on her cheek, his touch surprisingly soft against the violence of the night. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who want something from me," he whispered, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, hidden hunger. "Money, power, blood, but you look at me like I'm a puzzle you've already solved. My syndicate is built on secrets, Zuri, but your secrets are older. They smell like grief." Zuri flinched, the quiet dignity finally cracking. She reached into the folds of her silk gown and pulled out the tarnished platinum tie bar she had scanned in the vault. "This belonged to my father," she said, her voice trembling with a 15-year-old rage. "He was murdered for a drive your organization moved through its accounts. I didn't come to Seoul for a job, Minyi. I came for the man who wore these shoes while my mother begged for our lives." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Minyi looked at the tie bar, and for the first time, Zuri saw a flicker of genuine pain in the obsidian depths of his eyes. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his forehead against hers, a gesture of raw, unexpected intimacy that felt like a surrender. "I didn't kill them, Zuri," he breathed against her skin. "I was a child when that drive was moved, but the man who did, he's the one who gave me this empire. He's the reason I'm trapped in this glass cage." They stood there, two predators bound by the same ghost, the rain soaking through her silk and his wool. The secrets were out, laid bare in the filth of an alleyway. They weren't just allies or enemies anymore. They were two halves of a tragedy that was finally reaching its climax. "He thinks I'm a ghost," Zuri said, pulling back to look him in the eye. "But a ghost can't take back what was stolen. I'm going to unmake him, Minyi, with or without you." Minyi reached down, picking up her discarded silver heels and handing them to her with a grim, knowing smile. "Then let's give him a haunting he won't survive." The glass and steel monolith of the Cha Corporation headquarters pierced the morning fog of Seoul like a jagged silver needle. Inside the top-floor boardroom, the air was stale with the scent of expensive cigars and the frantic energy of men watching their world crumble in real time. The glitch Zuri had planted at the gala had become a viral contagion, a digital parasite that had devoured 40% of the company's market cap before the opening bell. "Where is the chairman?" Director Park barked, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. He was the same man who, 3 nights ago, had dropped a lit cigarette into Zuri's serving tray just to watch her flinch. And who is this AG Holdings that just executed a hostile levered buyout in under 6 hours? The heavy double doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They hissed with the weight of absolute authority. Zuri Ashford walked in, the rhythmic click of her heels on the polished granite sounding like the steady beat of a war drum. She wasn't wearing a polyester vest or a midnight blue gown. She wore a charcoal power suit tailored with surgical precision, her natural curls crown-like and defiant. Behind her, a phalanx of international legal counsel followed in a silent, grim wake. The room went deathly still. Director Park stood up, his face contorting into a mask of confused derision. What is the meaning of this? Guards, why is the waitress from the Sapphire Lounge in my boardroom? Zuri didn't stop until she reached the head of the table. She pulled out the high-backed leather chair, the chairman's chair, and sat down with a grace that made the men in the room look like clumsy children. She folded her hands on the table, her expression a masterpiece of cold, predatory serenity. "My name is Zuri Ashford," she said, her voice a low, clear chime that cut through the stagnant air. "I am the founder and sole proprietor of Ashford Global, and as of 9:02 a.m. this morning, Director Park, this is no longer your boardroom. It is my office." A ripple of panicked whispers erupted, but Zuri silenced them with a single, sharp look. She reached into her leather portfolio and tossed a single sheet of paper onto the table. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a high-resolution photo of the platinum Thai bar she had found in their vault. "For 15 years, your organization has built its wealth on the stolen legacy of my family," Zuri continued, her eyes locking onto Park, with the intensity of a laser. "You thought I was the help. You thought my skin and my gender made me a ghost you could ignore while you laundered the blood from your hands. But while you were laughing at the girl on her knees, the waitress was recording every illegal offshore transfer and every violated patent in your internal server." She leaned forward, her quiet dignity now a weapon of mass destruction. "I didn't just buy your stock. I bought your debt. I bought your mortgages. I bought the very ground this building stands on. By noon, your assets will be frozen by the International Criminal Court. By sunset, you will be as invisible as you thought I was." The silence that followed was absolute. The men who had mocked her, who had treated her like furniture, now looked at her with a terror that bordered on worship. Zuri didn't feel joy. She felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a circuit finally closing. She looked toward the darkened glass of the observation window, knowing Minyi was standing on the other side. The hunt was almost over. The poor girl had finished her harvest. The penthouse of the Cha monolith was a glass cage suspended over a city that didn't yet know its masters had changed. Inside, the air was cold, stripped of the manufactured warmth of the Gala. At the far end of the obsidian desk sat the chairman, the man whose polished shoes Zuri had memorized from the floor of a crawlspace 15 years ago. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an exhausted bureaucrat drowning in a sea of red digital ink. "You've burned it all," the chairman whispered, his voice cracking as he watched his empire's stock ticker flatline on the wall-sized monitors. "For a Thai bar and a grudge, you've dismantled 30 years of progress." Zuri stood before him, her silhouette framed by the lightning of a gathering storm over Seoul. "I didn't burn it for a grudge," she said, her voice a calm, terrifying low. "I burned it for the truth. You didn't just steal a drive, you stole a future. My father didn't build that encryption for your syndicate to hide human trafficking and blood money. He built it to protect the world from men like you." She stepped forward, placing a sleek, transparent tablet on the desk. It flickered to life, displaying a live feed of Interpol agents breaching the Sapphire Lounge and the syndicate's private docks. "The decryption key wasn't in the drive you stole. It was in me. I am the algorithm, Chairman, and I just hit delete on your entire existence." The man reached for a hidden drawer, his eyes wild with the desperate reflex of a cornered animal. But before his hand could find the cold steel of a weapon, the shadow behind Zuri moved. Seo Minyi stepped into the light, his silenced pistol leveled with a steady, clinical indifference. "The era of the old guard is over," Minyi said, his gaze never leaving the chairman's face. You taught me that power is a zero-sum game. You just forgot that eventually, someone smarter and hungrier would come to collect the debt. There was no cinematic explosion, no screaming match. There was only the soft click of handcuffs as Zuri's private security detail entered the room, and the silent, hollow look of a man realizing he had been outplayed by a ghost. As they led the chairman away, Zuri didn't feel the rush of adrenaline she had expected. She felt a profound, heavy stillness, the weight of a crown she had finally reclaimed. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling neon veins of Seoul. The rain streaked the glass, blurring the world into a wash of light and shadow. Minnie joined her, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his shoulder. He didn't speak. He simply waited, giving her the silence she had earned. I spent 15 years running toward this moment, Zuri said softly, her reflection in the glass looking back at her. No longer a waitress, no longer a victim, but a titan. I don't know how to exist without the hunt. Minnie turned to her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. His grip was firm, a silent promise of an alliance that transcended the blood and the code. Then we stop hunting ghosts, he said, his eyes reflecting the flickering city lights. And we start building something that can't be broken. A new empire, Zuri, one that belongs to us. Zuri looked at their joined hands, the hacker and the heir, the genius and the ghost. The silk and steel cycle had reached its end, and as the sun began to break through the Seoul clouds, she realized the hunt wasn't over. It had simply evolved. She leaned her head against Minnie's shoulder, watching the dawn of a world they now owned together. The girl from the projects had finally found her throne.